Poor girl told the paralyzed judge, "Free my dad and I'll heal you." Everyone laughed until she surprised all. The courtroom felt like it had stopped breathing. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, cutting across the oak-paneled walls and falling onto the bench where Judge Margaret Hayes sat. Her wheelchair was drawn close to the desk, her hands resting still on the polished wood, her face composed but shadowed by years of pain. Across the room, a little girl stood on tiptoe to reach the microphone. She couldn't have been more than 8, her dress too small at the hem, her shoes scuffed from long walks on gravel roads, but her eyes, wide, steady, unflinching, seemed to fill the entire chamber. Her voice, small but unwavering, carried through the still air. "Free my dad, and I'll heal you." The words did not sound childish. They did not sound like fantasy. They landed like a quiet vow. A murmur stirred at the back of the room. The bailiff shifted. Someone stifled a laugh. But Judge Hayes didn't move, didn't speak. She only studied the girl, as if weighing something invisible, something no one else could touch. In that moment, the silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was waiting. And if you stay with this story, you'll see how the courage of one little girl began to turn the impossible into the unforgettable. But before we dive into the story, please like the video and hit that subscribe button, and feel free to leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. The silence stretched, thick and uneasy. Judge Margaret Hayes kept her gaze on the little girl, her lips pressed into a line, her hands tightening slightly on the arms of her wheelchair. From the benches behind, a low chuckle rippled through the crowd. It came first from the prosecution's table. Assistant District Attorney Frank Dalton leaned back in his chair, his smirk cutting across the quiet like a blade. Dalton was tall, sharp in his suit, the kind of man who had built his reputation on winning, no matter what the cost. "Your Honor," Dalton said, his voice oozing control, "with all due respect, this is highly irregular. We cannot allow courtroom proceedings to be hijacked by childish games." He gestured toward the girl, dismissive. "She doesn't belong here. None of this belongs here." The little girl's small hands curled into fists at her sides. She didn't blink, didn't look away. Her voice had been steady once. Now her silence was steadier. Judge Hayes cleared her throat. "Mr. Dalton," she said, her voice even but firm, "this child has made a statement before the court, and while unusual, it will be heard." Dalton frowned, leaning forward, his tone growing sharper. "Your Honor, we are discussing the case of Daniel Walker, a repeat offender, a man who has shown disregard for the law at every turn. This isn't the place for fairy tales." The girl's father— "My dad," the girl interrupted softly, her voice like a stone dropping into still water. The interruption startled everyone, a child cutting across the district attorney's words. Even Dalton paused, blinking at her. Emily's heart was pounding, but she stood taller. She could feel her knees trembling inside her thin dress, but she locked her gaze on the judge. Inside, her thoughts rushed like a storm. They don't know him. They don't know what he's really like. They don't know the nights he carried me when I was sick, even when he was so tired from working 2 shifts. They don't know how much he tried. Her eyes dropped for a moment to Judge Hayes' motionless hands resting against the desk. A memory stirred. Long nights kneeling by her bed, whispering prayers she barely understood. She had asked for strength then, and strength had come. Not in big miracles, but in little sparks that kept her going. Maybe this was one of those sparks. Dalton's voice cut back in, rising now. "This is a distraction. If we allow this spectacle, then what precedent are we setting?" He looked at the judge, his tone heavy with confidence. "Justice is not a stage for sympathy." But sympathy was not what the girl was asking for. She raised her chin and spoke again. Her voice trembled at first, but grew steadier with every word. "My dad doesn't belong in a cell. He belongs with me. He's not bad. He just made mistakes." She paused, drawing in a shaky breath. "And I can help you. I can heal you. I know how." Gasps fluttered through the room. Someone whispered, "Heal her? What is she talking about?" Another scoffed, "That kid's out of her mind." Dalton seized on it, his smirk returning. "There it is. Proof. This is nothing more than a fantasy spun by a desperate child. Heal the judge? Your Honor, I think we've heard enough. But the judge didn't gavel it down. She didn't dismiss it. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes never leaving Emily's face. For the first time in years, there was something flickering in Judge Hayes's gaze that wasn't pain or weariness. It was curiosity. Emily swallowed hard. Her small fingers brushed the edge of the microphone stand. She could feel the weight of every eye in the room pressing down on her tiny shoulders. But beneath it all, she felt something stronger, a quiet certainty. They don't know what I've practiced. They don't know how many times I tried. Mom always said I had a gift. Dad believed it too. Even when he was tired, even when his hands were cracked from work, he said, "One day, Em, you'll help somebody no one else can." Her father's voice lived inside her now, steadying her as she faced the sea of doubt. Judge Hayes finally spoke, her voice carrying the authority of the bench but softened by something else, something human. "Child," she said slowly, "you claim you can heal me. How?" Emily's lips parted. For a moment she thought of explaining. She thought of telling them about the nights she practiced with her little brother when he scraped his knees, how she would place her hands and focus, how sometimes the pain lessened, how sometimes the swelling eased. She thought of telling them about the church basement where she once placed her palms on an old neighbor's wrist and watched the tremor calm, just a little. But she didn't explain. She only whispered, "Please, let me show you." Dalton barked a laugh, standing sharply. "This is outrageous. Your Honor, you cannot entertain—" "Sit down, Mr. Dalton," Judge Hayes said suddenly, her voice cutting through his like a blade. The courtroom hushed. Emily's heart soared with both fear and hope. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew the judge had listened. She knew the door had opened, even just a crack. For the first time in years, Judge Hayes allowed her hand to tremble as she lowered it toward her lap, her thoughts hidden behind her steady gaze. What if the impossible could be possible? The crowd leaned forward, restless, buzzing with disbelief. Some sneered, some whispered, but at the center of it all stood a little girl, poor and small, daring to speak power into a room built on doubt. And as the gavel waited, untouched, the real trial had just begun. The air in the courtroom was so still it seemed fragile. One word too loud might shatter it. Judge Hayes's eyes lingered on the girl. The years of paralysis had worn at her, turning even the smallest movements into battles. She had heard every cure, every promise, every hollow reassurance from doctors, who eventually lowered their eyes and said nothing more could be done. But now, a little girl stood in front of her, asking for a chance. Emily's voice was quiet but firm. "Please, Your Honor, just let me try." Judge Hayes studied her, the gavel heavy in her hand. She could feel Dalton's glare burning from the prosecution's table. He leaned forward, his voice sharp and commanding. "Your Honor, this is absurd. We cannot reduce these proceedings to—" "Enough, Mr. Dalton." The words silenced him instantly. The judge turned her gaze back to the girl. Slowly, deliberately, she nodded once. "Approach." A collective gasp rolled through the courtroom. Dalton shot to his feet. "You cannot be serious." "I said sit down," Judge Hayes snapped, her voice regaining the authority that once made entire courtrooms bend. Emily's legs trembled as she walked forward. The floorboards creaked beneath her small steps. She could feel eyes drilling into her back, some mocking, some pitying, but a very few, hopeful. When she reached the bench, she looked up at the judge's wheelchair. The woman's posture was upright, strong above the waist, but her legs were still, locked in silence. Emily's small hands lifted, hesitant, almost trembling. "May I?" Judge Hayes hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. Decades of walls, of dignity, of authority, all clashed with something soft inside her that hadn't stirred in years. At last she lowered her eyes, nodded, and whispered, "Yes." The girl placed her palms gently against the judge's knees. The courtroom went completely silent. Even the old ceiling fan seemed to stop humming. Emily closed her eyes. She didn't think about the people watching, or the lawyer sneering, or the whispers that circled her like cold wind. She thought about her dad, about the nights he carried her when her shoes wore holes, about how he whispered, "Keep going, Emmy. Don't give up even when they laugh at you." Her little hands pressed firmly, not magical, Not dramatic, just steady, warm, and filled with the kind of belief that cannot be bought. Seconds stretched. Dalton snorted under his breath. "This is a circus." "Quiet," Judge Hayes whispered. Her voice wasn't sharp this time. It was trembling. The room leaned forward as one. At first, nothing, only silence. Then a flicker, an almost imperceptible twitch beneath the judge's robe. Her breath caught. She looked down, eyes widening as she saw what no one else yet noticed. Emily kept her palms steady. She wasn't pushing, wasn't forcing, just holding, with every ounce of care her small body could give. And then, Judge Hayes's right foot shifted. Gasps exploded through the chamber. Someone dropped a notebook. A woman covered her mouth with both hands. Dalton froze, the smirk wiped clean from his face. "No," he whispered, too soft for anyone but himself to hear. The judge's eyes filled with tears. Her hand reached instinctively for the armrest, gripping as her knee bent, just slightly, shakily, but undeniably. For the first time in 20 years, her leg had moved. The courtroom was a storm of disbelief, voices rising, people standing. The bailiff shouted for order, banging his hand against the wall. But through the chaos, Emily kept her hands where they were, eyes still closed, face serene. When she finally opened her eyes, she whispered, "See? He believed in me, just like I believe in him." Judge Hayes's throat tightened. She blinked hard, struggling to speak. Finally, her voice broke through the whirlwind. "Order in the court!" The room froze. She looked down at the little girl, then out at the crowd. For a moment, her mask of authority cracked wide open, showing a woman who had suffered, who had lost hope, who was now holding the impossible between trembling hands. Her gaze landed on Dalton, whose confidence had drained into pale disbelief. "Mr. Dalton," she said firmly, her voice resonant and commanding once again, "this court will not dismiss what just happened here. Not today, not ever." Emily lowered her hands, stepping back slowly. Her heart was racing, but her face was calm. She didn't need applause. She didn't need anyone to believe. She had already seen the judge's foot move. She had already proven herself. The silence returned, but it was no longer heavy. It was alive, waiting. Judge Hayes wiped a tear from her cheek before it could fall. "This child has shown me something I thought I would never feel again. Hope, and I will not ignore it." For the first time, Emily allowed herself the smallest smile. Not of victory, not of triumph, but of quiet knowing. Something had shifted forever in that courtroom, and nothing, no law, no mockery, no doubt, could turn it back. The courtroom no longer felt like the same place. Only moments earlier, the air had been thick with doubt and disbelief. Now it was softer, alive, as though everyone inside had witnessed something that pulled them out of themselves. Even the sunlight streaming through the tall windows seemed warmer, as if the room itself was breathing again. Judge Hayes sat quietly, her hands trembling slightly on the arms of her wheelchair. Her foot had moved. No one could deny it, not even the ones who had mocked, scoffed, or dismissed. The shift had been real, undeniable, unshakable. For the first time in years, Margaret Hayes allowed herself to simply feel. Not as a judge, not as a symbol of authority, but as a woman who had lived with pain, with stillness, with resignation. A woman who had just been touched by hope. She lowered her gaze to the little girl, still standing in front of her bench. Emily's small shoulders looked so fragile under the weight of so many stares, yet she stood with quiet strength. Her hands hung calmly at her sides now. No pride, no gloating, just stillness, as though she had expected nothing less. From the prosecution's table, Frank Dalton's chair scraped loudly against the floor. He rose to his feet, his confident posture strangely unsure. His face was pale, his jaw tight. For the first time since he'd walked into that courtroom, he seemed smaller. He cleared his throat. "Your Honor," he said, his voice quieter than before, stripped of its usual arrogance, "I may have been too quick to dismiss this child." He glanced toward Emily, his eyes flickering with something she had never seen in him before. Respect. "I was wrong." A murmur rolled through the gallery. Some nodded, some whispered, but no one laughed anymore. Emily lifted her eyes to him. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence was enough. Judge Hayes let the moment breathe. Then slowly she addressed Dalton. It takes more courage to admit fault than to win an argument. Her words landed gently but firmly, and for once Dalton didn't argue back. He lowered his head in quiet acknowledgement. From the benches, a woman's voice broke the stillness. Could she help my son? He's been in pain for years. Another voice followed, a man clutching his hat in his hands. My wife, she can't walk far anymore. Maybe. Soon more voices rose, hesitant, hopeful, almost afraid to ask, but unable to hold back. It wasn't a frenzy, it wasn't chaos. It was softer than that, like a river slowly breaking through stone. Emily listened, her heart beating fast. She didn't look overwhelmed. She didn't glow with pride. She simply nodded once, acknowledging their words with the same calm presence she had shown all along. She thought of her dad, how he always said, "Don't let praise get to your head, Emmy. Don't let doubt sink in either. Just stay steady, and the truth will show itself." So she stayed steady. Judge Hayes lifted a hand, quieting the room once more. Her voice carried strength again, though it was laced with a new tenderness. This child has done something extraordinary here today. Whether you believe it or not, whether you understand it or not, none of us can deny what we've seen. She paused, her eyes returning to Emily. Respect is earned not by age, not by wealth, not by power, but by truth. And today, this little girl has earned ours. The courtroom held its breath. Emily didn't smile. She didn't bow. She simply lowered her eyes as though carrying the weight of that respect with quiet acceptance. In the back row, someone began to clap. Slowly, softly. Then another joined. Soon the sound spread, filling the chamber with an applause that wasn't loud or wild. It was gentle, reverent. Dalton didn't clap, but he didn't sneer either. He simply watched Emily with an expression that had never crossed his face in court before. Humility. Judge Hayes let the sound linger before raising her gavel. A single strike echoed like a heartbeat through the room. Court is adjourned, she said, her voice firm, her eyes glistening. As the crowd began to file out, many stopped to glance back at the little girl, some with tears, some with nods of respect. All with the same unspoken question in their eyes. How did she do it? Emily didn't try to explain. She just stood there, small and steady, as if her very presence was enough. The courtroom emptied slowly, but the feeling it carried would not fade. Something had shifted in that space, in the judge, in the lawyer, in the people who had witnessed it. And in the center of it all, Emily Walker had earned what no wealth or power could buy. Respect, given freely, held deeply, carried forward. The courthouse steps glowed in the late afternoon sun, long shadows stretching across the wide stone staircase. People lingered outside, their voices hushed but full of wonder, as though they had all walked out of a place where something sacred had taken root. Emily stood at the bottom step, her small hand clasped tightly in her father's. Daniel Walker had been brought into court in chains that morning. Now, though the trial was not yet finished, Judge Hayes had ordered him released under her supervision until the final ruling. A man who raised a child like this, she had said, deserves the chance to prove he can stand tall again. The words still rang in his ears. For years he had been seen as nothing more than a broken man, a burden to the system. But today, through the voice of his daughter, he had been seen differently. Through the eyes of mercy, through the eyes of hope. Reporters pressed forward, microphones extended, but none shouted, none demanded. They asked gently, as though their own voices felt too heavy for the moment. "Emily," one of them whispered, "what happens next?" The little girl tilted her head, her hair catching the sun. She didn't answer right away. She looked up at her father, then back at the courthouse doors, where Judge Hayes now appeared, guided carefully by her clerk. The judge's wheelchair rolled slowly, but her hands rested lighter on the arms, her eyes brighter than they had been in years. When the crowd saw her, silence fell again, not out of fear, but out of reverence. Judge Hayes stopped midway down the steps and spoke, her voice carrying steady. This child has reminded us all that justice is not only about punishment, it is also about healing. Today, I saw with my own eyes what the power of belief, courage, and compassion can do, and I will not let it fade. She turned her gaze directly to Emily. I would like to invite you, child, to work with this court, not as a witness, not as a defendant's daughter, but as a helper, someone who can remind us, when we forget, that people are more than their mistakes. Gas rippled through the crowd. A judge offering an official role to a little girl? It sounded impossible. And yet, in the wake of what they had witnessed, it felt undeniable. Emily blinked, her small fingers tightening around her father's hand. She didn't know what such a role meant. She didn't know if she could carry it, but she knew she had been seen, truly seen, for the first time in her life. Her father leaned close, whispering, "It's your choice, Emmy, but whatever you choose, I'm proud of you." She lifted her chin and nodded to the judge. "I'll help." The crowd stirred. For the first time, people weren't looking at the lawyers or the officials. They were looking at her, the little girl who had once been invisible, poor, overlooked. Now they saw her as something else, a guide, a reminder, a force for change. In the weeks that followed, the courthouse transformed in small but profound ways. Emily was not given a title or a desk. She didn't wear a robe or carry authority. But whenever a case grew heavy with anger or despair, someone would call, "Bring in the girl," and she would come, sometimes only to sit quietly beside a trembling witness, sometimes to place her hands gently on someone's shoulders, sometimes only to remind the room with her steady presence that healing and justice belong together. Even Dalton, once arrogant and immovable, found himself changed. One afternoon, he stopped her in the hallway, his voice low. "Emily," he said, clearing his throat awkwardly, "I was wrong about you. And I was wrong about your dad." He looked away, uncomfortable with his own humility. "Thank you for proving me wrong." Emily only nodded, her eyes calm. She had no need to win. Her father, meanwhile, began to rebuild. He worked quietly, steadily, determined to honor the second chance his daughter had helped carve for him. Every evening, when he came home tired but free, he would sit with Emily on the porch, watching the sun dip low, whispering, "You've changed everything, Emmy, not just for me, for all of us." And the judge, Margaret Hayes, continued to feel life stirring in her legs, slowly, painfully, but undeniably. Each day she moved a little more. Each day she carried not just the weight of the law, but the hope she had nearly lost. She credited Emily every time someone asked, but in truth, she credited more than that. She credited the reminder that healing begins the moment someone believes it can. Months later, a plaque was placed in the courthouse hallway. It did not carry Emily's name alone. It read, "Justice and healing belong together. Let us never forget." And beneath the inscription, in smaller letters, "Inspired by the courage of a child." Emily never stopped being small, never stopped being quiet, but in her steadiness, she became something larger than herself, a living reminder that the most overlooked voices can sometimes carry the power to change everything. And as she sat once again beside her father on their porch, fireflies flickering in the dusk, she whispered softly, more to herself than anyone else, "We're not invisible anymore." What began as an ordinary day in a quiet courtroom became something no one there would ever forget. A little girl's voice, steady, unshaken, full of quiet hope, reminded an entire room that healing and justice are not separate, but deeply connected. She didn't walk in with power, wealth, or influence. She walked in with belief, and that was enough to move hearts and even a judge's legs for the first time in 20 years. And maybe that's the question this story leaves for us. What do we believe in when the world tells us not to? Do we keep speaking up even when no one listens? Do we keep standing even when we feel small? Do we keep loving even when it costs us everything? Because sometimes the most extraordinary changes don't come from the loudest voices, but from the quietest ones, spoken with courage. So what about you? Has there been a moment in your life when a child, a loved one, or even a stranger surprised you with a kind of strength you didn't expect? We'd love to hear your story in the comments below. Share this video with someone who might need a reminder that hope is never too small to matter. And if you'd like more stories like this, stories that show the power of love, belief, and courage, make sure to subscribe and stay with us, because sometimes the voices we least expect are the ones we most need to hear.